It's a pleasure to be here. It truly is a great opportunity because it actually is the place where I found my birth in the renewable energy space. And for just a background so that you understand who I am and what I bring to the table, first and foremost, I, as you heard, spent 33 years of my life. Great opportunity. I was drafted in 1972 and ended up seeking a deferment through a college program that ended up being a ROTC scholarship, which ended up being service anyway, which ended up closer to 40 years than my 4 years as expected. But I joined the Navy to see the world, and for that reason I did. I can say that the Navy provided me every opportunity to do that. I visited 63 different countries and 154 different ports. So I've seen the world differently than most, and I bring that perspective to the table when I start talking about why it's important that we move forward and understand from a global perspective why the renewable energy space and alternative fuels being a very critical part is so important to our national security and our global stability. So I've seen the most extremes. As a matter of fact, I had the opportunity to circumnavigate the globe in a matter of about 4.5 seconds as I stood atop the North Pole. Temperature, 91 below zero. Cake. It was getting those first 4 deep breaths that was the most difficult. And my most extreme, 1995 in the Persian Gulf, 141 degrees at 11 o'clock in the morning. And we had already done about 7.5 hours worth of work when I finally called the battle group commander and said, enough's enough. We need a break. So I also bring into the discussion a little bit more of my background, and that is I received a degree. My undergraduate degree is in meteorology and oceanography. So I understand the physical sciences associated with both of those fluids, and they are very similar. The only differences are the coefficients you use to define them in a physical sense. Now, I also have a degree, a master's degree from the Naval War College in International Relations and Strategic Studies. So I have studied the use of military forces to secure a nation or a nations, from the Peloponnesian War to the war that I was engaged in 1991 when I went there. And I also have a master's in business. Hence, I think that's really the reason that got me to the space in which I became the base commanding officer of Naval Base San Diego, which is the largest facility in the Navy's inventory. It was not for the sense of renewable energies that I embarked on the mission that got me to this place today. If you remember that in 1991, 1999, when I came there, the Congress had made a decision to stop funding the war through a War Powers Act and started funding the war and our efforts in the Middle East through our own operational budget, which means the operational budget was now impacted by what we were doing in the Middle East, and we no longer had the capacity to be able to support a warfighting effort in the same fashion. We needed to find ways to reduce our budget. Hence, you go figure out how to make literally the back office more efficient. So in the typical fashion, I looked at where were my biggest bills, and those biggest bills, of course, were energy and water. Within the first year, I reduced energy consumption on the naval base by 42%. By the time I had left command 3 years later, I had saved more than 3 billion gallons of water, saving the taxpayer literally hundreds of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis. As a matter of fact, the 42% reduction actually equated to about an $18.2 million savings on a quarterly basis. So as the largest energy user in Southern California, my monthly energy bill was somewhere around $31.6, $31.7 million. And my savings across that time frame was actually the effort in which allowed us for the very first time not to go to the Congress and pay for the change in California during deregulation. I actually had a Congress for appropriations in base, the only base in the southwestern United States capable of doing that. In that brought tremendous interest from Washington, D.C., and said, okay, how'd you do that? And what have you embarked in that we don't know about? And many of the efforts that we embarked in, very similar to the efforts for photovoltaic wind, I embarked in an opportunity to help a fledgling biodiesel company in downtown San Diego called New Leaf, who took fats, basically food fats from our restaurant waste, frying our fat foods and such, put it in a big distiller and created biodiesel product. And I told Julie that I would virtually buy everything that she could produce, and I changed my entire fleet, my non-tactical fleet, to a biodiesel product. And it was the first movement in the Navy. Nearly cost me my job, and I can go into details later about why. But it got to the point where she couldn't produce enough, and I actually had to go to Arizona to get the excesses, because once you shift over, it's really difficult to go back and forth. But it cost me $1.80 more per gallon, and I blew through my fuel budget instead of reducing my fuel budget. But that wasn't the part that was the most important, because by the time the end of the second year, she was not only producing my quantity requirements, she was overproducing, and we had to figure out how to fleet. So to me, it was a testimony of just how fast this can grow. Now, so I've done all those things, and I spent 33 years defending this country and putting together those things that I thought was the most important, and I raised my right hand and said, so help me God, I will. But when I retired, I started to look at different reasons for doing what I wanted to do going forward. So I joined the University of San Diego as their vice president. In the 2-year time that I was aboard, installed the largest photovoltaic system of any private campus in the country, in which I reduced their energy costs by $1.8 million a year, which went directly to tuition. But it started down that track and said, hey, you know what, not so fast. Academia doesn't move this fast, but I don't slow down. Once I get started, I just keep going. So I left the university and I joined the Center for Sustainable Energy, which is an advocate for a transition to a more clean and renewable space for the future. Includes biodiesel, alternative fuels. We are the Southwestern Alternative Fuels Center, hence my relationship with the National Biodiesel Board as an ambassador. But the relationship goes a lot further, and the reason why I do what I do today is really this. This is my reason for being sustainable, and why I believe that it's very, very important that we start having a much more deliberate conversation about who and what and why we are doing what we're doing. These are my 3 grandchildren. And when I look across the globe in total, I realize that we're not doing a very good job of making absolutely certain that their security, their prosperity, and their opportunities equal what I was provided. As a matter of fact, combined with all of the things that I now know about the globe after virtually years of research, and I'm going to give you some of the reasons why it's more important that we start focusing on this particular issue directly than we have in the past, and why legislators need to get their proverbial head out and start looking inside as well as outside, and what it means when we say our security is tied to our prosperity, and our prosperity, unfortunately, is tied to a finite resource. And it doesn't make any difference what you label it as. It can be coal, it can be anything. It's fossil fuels, and our prosperity and the definition of our prosperity and progress is, in fact, that very resource. So why is it important? What does it mean? Well, let me tell you where we are and why it's more important that we have a much more deliberate approach at looking at the globe in a different sense, because times are changing fast. And they're changing in a way that we still have not had a deliberate conversation as adults into what that means to us into the future. But it does have everything to do with what you're doing here, and that is the birth of a new industry that provides opportunity, not just locally, but across the globe, because that's really what it's all about. So let me tell you what the world, why it is important that I think from a security perspective, we start focusing our attentions on the bigger picture and how alternative fuels play into that picture. First, how many of you know that we are in the midst of our second doubling on the face of the planet in population? Second. So from the time of birth of the mankind to 1850, it took us that long to get from 0 to 1.5 billion. From 1850 today, we went from 1.5 to 7.2 billion. By 2050, this world will have anywhere from 9.2 to 9.6 billion. That is equivalent to adding the population of China and India combined to the face of the globe. Every single month, 12 million new mouths are added to our world's population. The sad part is, it's not in the industrialized nations who are more capable of being able to provide for those individuals. It is in the least populated, least capable nations of the world who are moving at a rate 6 times faster to look, smell, and feel like Americans. It took us 3 centuries to go from the basically from the start to where we are today. And you already heard from General Clark this morning that those nations on the stretches are moving from the 15th century to the 21st century virtually overnight. And the opportunity that provides that is energy. And the energy demands of the rest of the world are increasing at a rate exponential to anything that we've seen in the past 300 years. And recognize that we, the industrialized world as we define it, only represent 13% of the world's population today. But yet we control and use 75% of the world's resources. So when you start looking at the potential for conflict, you have to recognize that those are conditions that we need to realize are all part of the bigger picture. Our oceans are very, very sick. Less than 3% of the adult population of our world's oceans that existed just 50 years ago now exist in the world as we know it. Acidification and other issues are seriously damaging our coral reefs. The South China Sea has never been an issue until recently, because the biodiversity of the China Sea is now at risk, which means the fish population has moved to the South China Sea and China now wants claim. The really sad part about it is that's a region of the world where nearly 70% of that population gets its protein from the sea. But we virtually outfished it. The next and most important part of that is nutrition. If you recognize that the doubling, as we know it, is all part of this equation going forward, we have to figure out how to feed that population. And if that doubling occurs, as is projected, and UNHCR basically says it's already there, there's nothing you can do to stop it. By the time we reach 2050, we will have to produce more food in the next 40 years than mankind has in its last 10,000. Imagine that. So here we're talking about an industry that potentially provides the opportunity, but yet we have regulation and government that doesn't understand how important it is for the rebirth of America's agriculture. And it is coupled to what the future then leads. Did you know that today we throw out 80,000 tons of processed grains and cereals, the stuff that you guys grow, because we fail to sell it by sell-by date? But yet the world is in a crisis where 1.5% of the world's population today is clinically malnourished. And that means no matter how much nutrition you provide to that individual, they will not reach mortality because the basic nutrition of life was deprived while they were in their forming years, age 1 to 3. So we're in a crisis in that perspective. Again, the world is moving at a rate 6 times faster, and coupled with that is climate change. Now, this is not a red or blue thing. It's not a US or something else thing. And again, I was a climate denier until about 2005 when I started doing a lot more research. And again, I'm a meteorologist and climate and oceanographer by degree. I started listening to a lot more of my friends and began the art of climatology, which is a study of the climate over a 100-year period. Climate and weather are 2 different things, although we can't get laymen to understand that. The impacts of Juno in the weather are a result of our climate change, but the world's climate is changing 10 times faster than it has in the last 65 million years. And 97% of all climatologists agree with that figure. So in the last 65 million years, we have seen the greatest change with a periodicity of extreme weather conditions 200% over 1970. So we have seen the more severe weather in the last decade than the previous 2 decades, but we are now 200% greater in severe weather conditions than what we saw in 1970. Now, why does that mean anything? Because as climate change occurs, so too does normal things like sea level rise, which everybody has to be concerned about. If you followed the news, December the 6th of 2014, the island in the Philippines, Hapta, the typhoon that went through there, created 1.28 million homeless. 1.28 million homeless American citizens. I mean, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? But if sea level rise increases just to the lowest forecast of 17 inches, which is normal in cyclic, the Philippine Islands become virtually 12 to 18 million refugees, along with many of the islands in the Pacific. So it too creates an environment where our stability is at risk. Now, those will have major impacts, and they will have issues in a geopolitical environment that we should all be concerned about. If you recognize that over the course of the last century, the 20th century is the bloodiest century in mankind's history. The bloodiest. And believe it or not, there were only 13 nations really involved in this whole process. And with that, virtually everyone, including those that I've studied from the beginning, virtually all of them evolve around our access to resources. And while I'm not in uniform anymore, I don't have to defend what anyone says on the other side, but I can tell you the only reason I spent 20 months of my life in the Persian Gulf was to make absolutely certain I had access to a finite resource. Nothing else. They don't care. The truth is that we better start to care what that finality means in the bigger picture. So when you hear the conversation about why this is important, recognize this. The resource that we are provided, this finite fossil fuel, is principally the reason that the 20th century engaged in the most bloody century of mankind's history. The closer and closer we get to finality, the closer and closer we come to conflict. And therein lies the basics by which I start looking at how my grandchildren and their grandchildren might exist if we don't get moving. So why is it that we're having a conversation, and why are conferences like this so important? We can't wait another 2 decades to figure this out. And I don't want to make any condemnations, but it's time for the fat cats in Washington, D.C. to start getting out of their chairs and not having what I heard here this morning as reasons for not understanding your industry. It's time to get out of the chair and get out here and take a notice of what's happening. And I relate this to the same fashion as the renewable energy space, because here's where it all comes and why it's important. California, as you know, is the most progressive state in the renewable energy space. It's one of the reasons I decided to retire there. AB 32, the standards that reduce the carbon emissions, is the precipice by which virtually all the other regulations are there. And I'm not advocating that AB 32 is the right thing to do for everybody, but it is the very piece of legislation that caused the environment to happen. But here's the result. And that result is that California had the opportunity to seek capital that allowed the renewable energy portfolio within the state a security in its investment and its long-term renewable process. So today, as a matter of fact, within the next 3 weeks, I think, there will be a report released that says that the solar industry in California now employs more individuals than all 4 of the IOUs, investor-owned utilities, combined. Their growth projection, 17 to 22%. Growth projection of big industry, big energy, 4% in the negative. They're cutting employment to maintain their margins. And as the fuel prices change, petroleum prices, how many of you have seen a reduction in your energy costs? Are you being charged any less per kilowatt? I don't think so. Are you being charged any less for anything else that you buy that they're relying on this fossil fuel? I don't think so. And the conversation is already around the idea of how do we fix this? Well, we can't wait 4 decades for all of this to restabilize and get things moving. I'm absolutely convinced that the alternative fuel industry provides the opportunity that we need to make absolutely certain that we are on the forefront of providing independence in fuels. And when you look at the diagram, because this is a piece that even those individuals who I thought were really smart in Washington, they don't get this diagram. They seriously do not understand that this is pretty much where we are. And when you look at what this really means, and of course, these are the levels that we pull out, these are the productions, here's the new finds, and this, of course, is the capacity to meet demand. This is the demand curve. Based out of the ground, the same number, this is what this looks like. So when you consider the fact that we've accelerated production, or actually we've glutted the market with excesses above the 2010 numbers, that can only be sustained for so long. And I would contend that there's a lot to be said about how that can be manipulated for our own disadvantage. If you don't think so, read the article that was published in the Wall Street Journal just 2 Mondays ago, and it's called 6 Winners and 6 Losers. 6 winners and 6 losers forecast what would happen if, in fact, the oil prices maintained their present position at roughly 50 or maybe even lower. And what's really amazing is that the countries that will see an advantage are those countries whose economies have been stuck, Japan being one of them, primarily because they can't afford the high price of energy. It's the fossil fuel. They import nearly 90% of all their energy. If, in fact, the Japanese economy should happen to take off because oil prices stay at $50 a gallon, exactly how long will it take for Putin, and the real crisis here is, again, as a geopolitical guy, anytime Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela are mentioned in the same paragraph, we should be taking note. We should seriously be taking note. Putin is allowed to run away in the Ukraine today because he has control of natural gas in Europe. The only reason why European leaders are hesitant to provide any further sanctions on Russia is because he's threatened to shut off the gas. The more they need, the more they use, the more opportunity, and oh, by the way, those 3 nations that I just mentioned, Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, have more of this than any one of us combined. So when the demand for that energy becomes real, the only thing they have to do is turn off production, which is exactly what OPEC has been doing for the last 40 years, but they're no longer in control. As a matter of fact, I believe that what happened in Saudi Arabia that General Clark mentioned this morning backfired, because the 3 leaders of those countries are despots. And they don't care that their population is suffering from the low price of oil, because their populations have lived in misery for 40+ years. So who cares another decade or so if you can win the new Cold War without firing a shot? Because this is what it's all about. This is the security that I'm talking about when we say we better get our heads out of our proverbial. Because this is the inevitable in the alternative fuel space. Alternative and renewable energies afford us the opportunity to say, who cares? Go for it. Let it happen. Our administration has said it wants to create the opportunity for America to grow. Then why then is it restricting an entrepreneurial business that potentially can place America in a secure environment for the 21st century. Why would regulators not understand that it's important to keep the vitality of that industry at the forefront of their decision-making process? And again, if I were commanding officer and EPA worked for me, I would fire the commanding officer for dereliction of duty. And everybody along with it. Their responsibility is to make absolutely certain that America grows, and that's what we keep saying, but yet regulation is in the opposite direction. California, for example, and I hate to keep saying it, but again, the regulation provides the opportunity. Regulators just last year told the energy companies that they had to put in 3.3 gigawatts of storage in our renewable energy space. Each of the IOUs protested, saying that it was physically impossible and absolutely would decimate their business model. Well, we happen to run the self-generation incentive program in Southern California, and I can tell you that next week we will publish an article that says not only have we exceeded those opportunities, or not only have we met those opportunities, we've exceeded them in just under 10 months. And the industry, basically the energy companies, told the regulators that it would decimate their business model and it would take them years to secure that portfolio. By the end of May of next year, we will be at 1.3 gigawatts of storage in the renewable energy space, having secured that in just under 10 months. Why not in the alternative fuels business? Why can't those same opportunities be presented so that the capital is secure? Germany became the leading solar producer not because everybody wants to buy solar. Solar became the opportunity for Germany because they put in a system that lasted 17 years. So the capital was possible. Industry was able to forecast and build a business model that made sense. In this country lately, we do everything based on quarterly return. And we make no long-term decisions within our Congress today, none. And I hate to say it, but 10 years on the Ag Committee and you just learned about it? We have to be smarter. We can't take that as an excuse. People are moving to rural America. Well, how do you expect that rural America, or away from rural America into the cities? Well, how do you expect that city to survive? The more dense the population, the greater the energy requirements. Where do you expect to supply that energy requirements? And I'm very, very proud of the Department of Defense and where it's moving. As a matter of fact, I was talking to some folks outside and said, you know, Department of Defense is moving in a very aggressive fashion. The Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, has basically told the Navy that it is to deploy a green fleet in 2017. Air Force and Navy have been working very hard at trying to make absolutely certain that an alternative fuel can be used in our tactical fighters. So we're using an alternative fuel in the most combat sophisticated equipment that we have to prove that standards, because this is the myth, is that an alternative fuel will not provide the same capacity in the environment when it's called upon to do so. And that's the one thing we can't afford. Our tactical opportunity, we just simply can't take that risk. Well, guess what? The Air Force has been flying an F-16, an F-16, and we've been flying an F-18 in combat maneuvers and proven that there is no degradation, and that capacity now exists. As a matter of fact, the Air Force has flown a C-5 on biodiesel from coast to coast, fully loaded. It's possible. So if we can do it in our tactical engines, how come our EPA isn't considering the opportunity for you guys to dump a blend into our power plants? It doesn't all have to be transportation. There are other markets for the product. If transportation doesn't want to go to E85 because you're fighting the big business, then figure out how to get there from another route. That's what we did. The Navy looked at the different opportunities. Where can I where can I non-tactically use it, employ it, prove it, fix it? We need to do the same thing. There's no reason why those regulators can't help you get there. And again, we can't wait for 2 to 3 decades. There are consequences in the actions to stabilize the market and provide better opportunities for the industry to grow and the technology to come to the forefront, in my opinion, have been inept. And they do represent. If the administration, and I'm not talking administrator, I'm talking if the federal administration, regardless of who's in office, is really about fixing the problem between middle America and wage, you have to look at what opportunities you present for the reinsurgence of middle America to create jobs. And I know that if you look back just 20 years ago, the number of individuals involved in agriculture were nearly 3 times what they are today. So think of the job loss. But this represents a new and great opportunity. We just need the regulators and the government to get out of the way. Create the stability in the market as you were intended to do, and get out of the way. Allow the growth to be exactly the same type of growth that big business, big energy, oil, gas, got from the government when they first started. And it's important. It is important. So, when you look at it, the charge for today, again, prosperity means they're tied to finite resources. We need to find alternatives to make sure that that happens. And you at this conference represent those warriors who will take that charge to those who can make a difference. And again, I can tell you, individuals outside, and I have to admit, I'm not sure if it's senility or just stupidity, in which my senator introduced a piece of legislation that will potentially cause great animosity to this particular industry. But the education process needs to be done virtually every day across the globe. And we need to understand that it will lead to stability and opportunities. So I have to ask the question, and I do all the time. When you see headlines like this, and you don't see these in U.S. press, you have to ask why. And be very, very scared when individuals take it upon themselves to potentially destabilize the world economics. And what it means when these kind of things can happen, and how quickly they can be reversed. And what that means to each one of us in our daily lives going forward. So why is it that Congress will support this? Tens of thousands of Berea tar pits, tens of thousands of acres of Berea tar pits being created in the tar sand excavation. This is a pristine, on the left, you see where that pristine Quebec Valley was just 6 years ago, and where it is today. It will never, ever look like it did on the left. They'll support this, but they won't support this. They won't recognize that the conflict between the two can be supported through the biodiesel and alternative fuel industry. They'll support this, even though most of this is going to be exported, and it's still tied to a finite resource. Billions of our dollars will be tied into a resource that potentially will be depleted in just under 60 years. Because as you heard them say this morning, the well may be great today, but it decreases exponentially the moment you tap into it. So, why not this? What's wrong with this? Growing corn and soy and other products from the land and turning it into the product for use. They'll support this. This is a fracking field in North Carolina. They'll continue to support this, but they won't support this. an anaerobic digester, which is now producing gasoline-like products in Sacramento from food waste. She went from 10,000 gallons, and she's now producing 3 million gallons a year, just from cooperative efforts by the local community to collect their food waste, put it in a dumpster differently collected, and now creating it. 40% of everything that we grow in this country, we throw out. We throw out. Think of the energy and resources that it takes to do that. And what we should be doing is looking at, I would tell my folks, never throw anything out until you've used it at least twice. But yet every day, we throw out more food in this country than the entire continent of Europe consumes. Every day. Think of all your hard work and how wasteful of a society we've come, and recognize that those 5 measures that I told you in the beginning and Admiral and General Clark mentioned to you will all come in conflict at one point in time, because this has got to stop. We have to have a much more deliberate conversation about what it means and how the energy industry is getting advantaged in a fashion that you all are not being afforded. Across the entire globe, there's more than $1 trillion in subsidy. But yet in the renewable energy space, and biodiesel is included in the renewable energy space, it's only $38 billion. So give me a break. Why is it that MLPs are not being afforded to you, the energy business? Why? Because it will seriously affect how this is done. And more importantly, you might actually succeed, which is a threat to them. Make no toll, it's a threat. But what I charge with you today is you are the next warrior in the revolution. And I've said this often to entrepreneurs in the renewable space. I never thought I'd say it, but I can now out of uniform, that I want to lead the next revolution in this country. And that revolution is toward a country that is understanding of its responsibility in its use of its resources, and independent of energy sources in which we have no control. Because our security is absolutely tied to it. And when you say 100 million gallons, I say 500 million gallons. Because that's really where the market breaks into a different quote. So, thank you very much for your time. Please continue your charge. You are a very important part of where this country goes moving forward. And again, join the army of the revolution of renewable, a new renewable future, if not for yourself, for our grandkids. Thanks.
Thank you for your service, Admiral.